Hello, my name's Mary, and I'm coming to you from the children's room at the Portland Public Library. And today we're going to continue reading Gooney Bird Greene by Lois Lowry and illustrated by Mitty Thomas. The book was published by Houghton Mifflin Company in 2002. When we left Gooney Bird yesterday, she was just about to tell her class the story of how she got her name. How Gooney Bird got her name. Once upon a time, 8 years ago, a man and a woman named Mr. and Mrs. Greene, that's Greene with a silent E at the end, discovered that they were expecting a baby girl. The man's name was Gooney Greene, and the woman's name was Barbara Greene. They decided to name their baby girl with their initials, G for Gordon, B for Barbara. They thought of many different things. Gail Beth, said Mrs. Greene. She liked short names. Gwendolyn Belinda, said Mr. Greene. He liked long names. They discussed and they discussed. They never argued or fought, but they had many discussions. Once in the middle of the night, Mrs. Greene woke up. She'd had a dream about a name. She nudged Mr. Greene until he woke up a little bit, and then she said, Georgina Babette. No, he said, and went back to sleep. One night, Mr. Greene woke up, nudged his wife, and told her that he had had a dream. Gazpacho banana, he said. That was a nightmare you had, his wife said. He agreed. They both went back to sleep. Finally, because they could not make up their minds about a name, they decided that they would wait until the baby girl was born. Then they would look at the baby, and somehow they would know that her name should be Grace Bridget or Gloria Bonnie or some other name. They waited and waited for the baby's birth. It takes many months, as you know. Gooney Bird paused in her story. She could see that many of the children wanted to wave their hands in the air and say things. Class, she said, any comments so far? Any questions? We have 9 minutes left, Mrs. Pigeon reminded them, before arithmetic. Kiko asked in a small voice, did he really say gazpacho banana? Yes, he did, Gooney Bird said. I tell only absolutely true stories. Barry Tuckerman stood up beside his desk. I was named a B name for my grandfather, he said. My grandfather's name was Benjamin. That's my name, Ben called out. My grandfather was in college when my grandmother went to jail, Barry added, or he would have gone with her. Tricia raised her hand. My cat's name is Fluffernutter, she said. 4 more minutes, Mrs. Pigeon announced. Let's let Gooney Bird get back to her story so that we can hear the ending. Did you notice, class, she added, how she uses characters and dialogue? And her story is full of suspense. It's a cliffhanger, isn't it? What a good storyteller Gooney Bird is. Ready? Gooney Bird asked. Ready, shouted the class, all but Felicia Ann, who never shouted. Okay, here comes the ending. Finally, one spring morning, the baby girl was born. She weighed 6 pounds and 14 ounces. She had red hair. Look, said her mother. She wiggles her head around looking for food when she's hungry. Isn't that cute. It reminds me of something, but I forget what. Her father peered down at the new baby in his wife's arms. He smiled. She has very big feet. Isn't that cute? It reminds me of something, but I forget what. Mr. and Mrs. Greene looked at their sweet baby. They thought and thought. It's coming back to me, Mr. Greene said at last. Do you remember when we went on that bird-watching trip to various islands in the Pacific Ocean, and we saw all kinds of marine birds? That's it, his wife said. She looks very much like one of those birds. But which one? Let's get our photograph album from that trip, Mr. Greene said. Together they turned the pages of the album. Double-crested cormorant, Mrs. Greene said. They looked down at the baby. Nah, she didn't look like a double-crested cormorant. Red-necked grebe, Mr. Greene suggested. They looked at the baby again. She does have a red neck, Mr. Greene said. She does not, said Mrs. Greene. It's pink. They turned the pages some more. Suddenly they both said, oh. Very carefully they looked at the photograph, then very carefully they looked at the baby. Big feet, Mr. Greene said, just like our babies. A head that bobs around, Mrs. Greene said, just like our babies. That's the one, they agreed. They read the label under the photograph. Laysan albatross, the label said. I don't think Laysan albatross Greene is a very pretty name for a baby girl, Mrs. Greene said sadly. It sounds too scientific. I agree, Mr. Greene said, but look at the small print. Together, Mr. and Mrs. Greene read the words in the small print, often called Gooney Bird. Gooney Bird Greene, they said. I like the sound of it, Mrs. Greene said, and it has a G and a B. It does indeed, said Mr. Greene. So they decided to name their new baby girl Gooney Bird Greene. Then everyone, including a doctor, a midwife, and a cleaning lady, hugged and kissed and did a Viennese waltz together. The end. What a lovely story, Mrs. Pigeon said, and it gives us a chance to do some scientific research. We will look up Laysan albatross in the encyclopedia. Thank you, Gooney Bird. You may take your seat now, and we'll turn to our arithmetic. Wait, wait. Beanie's hand was waving in the air. Yes, Beanie, Mrs. Pigeon said. What's wrong? I want to hear about the diamond earrings and the prince and the palace. That's a different story, Gooney Bird said. She was walking back to her desk. Tell it, the children called. Barry Tuckerman jumped up and stood beside his desk. I want to hear how Gooney Bird came from China, he said. Oh, I came in a flying carpet, Gooney Bird said. But that's a different story, too. She adjusted her pink tutu and sat down. Tell it, the children called. Mrs. Pigeon laughed. I'm sure Gooney Bird was just joking about the prince and the palace and the diamond earrings and the flying carpet, too, she said. Gooney Bird had already opened her arithmetic book, and she looked up in surprise. No, she said. I wasn't joking. I tell only absolutely true stories. Well, said Mrs. Pigeon, Will you tell us another tomorrow? Of course, Gooney Bird said. Chapter 3. On Friday, Gooney Bird was wearing capri pants, a satin tank top, and a long string of pearls. Her red hair was twisted into one long braid, which was decorated with plastic flowers. There were flip-flops on her feet. You look beautiful, Kiko said to Gooney Bird in an admiring whisper. Yes, I know, Gooney Bird replied. Thank you, Kiko. She walked to the front of the classroom when Mrs. Pigeon told her it was time. Malcolm was back in the classroom. He was at his desk writing, I will never put anything in my nose 100 times on a piece of lined paper. The nurse had told him to do that. She said it would keep his hands busy. How come Gooney Bird gets to stand in front of class? Malcolm asked. Shh, everybody except Felicia Ann said to Malcolm. Listen. Today, Gooney Bird said, I have a very exciting story to tell you. In my story, there is a long journey, a mystery, and a rescue. Mrs. Pigeon, seated at her desk, had begun correcting some spelling papers. She looked up. Listen, second graders, she said. Hear the different things that Gooney Bird is putting into her story. That is what good storytellers do. Gooney Bird listened patiently to the teacher. Then she stood up straight and did some breathing exercises. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked at the class. I'm ready to begin, she said at last. The title of the story for today will be How Gooney Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet. Just like Aladdin, Barry Tuckerman said in a loud whisper. Barry, pay attention, please, Gooney Bird said. I like to have absolutely all eyes on me. Then, when the class became silent, all except Felicia Ann, who had been silent all along, and almost all eyes, even Mrs. Pigeon's, were on her, she began. How Gooney Bird Came from China on a Flying Carpet. Once upon a time, just last month, Mr. and Mrs. Greene decided to take their little girl, Gooney Bird, and move away from the place where they had always lived. They had always lived in China, but now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. It's here, Chelsea said aloud. I live in Water Tower. Gooney Bird stopped talking. She arranged her pearl necklace so that it was draped over one shoulder. Me too, Tricia said. We all live in Water Tower, Ben pointed out. That's why we go to the Water Tower Elementary School. Class, Mrs. Pigeon warned. Mrs. Pigeon, Gooney Bird said politely, let me take care of this. Children, she said in a firm voice, I cannot tell a story if I am constantly interrupted. There will be time for questions and comments. Please raise your hand if you want to say something. It's very interesting for me it's very distracting for me if you call out. Sorry, Tricia said. Sorry, Chelsea said. Sorry, Ben said. The class waited. Gooney Bird looked at them all sternly. Then she did some breathing exercises and began again. They had always lived in China, But now Mr. Greene had a new job, and his new job was in Water Tower. So they packed carefully. It took many days. First, Mr. Greene had to pack 43 sets of false teeth. Then Mrs. Greene had to pack her dancing shoes and her bathing suits. And Gooney Bird had to pack all of her belongings, which included a money collection. Finally, their furniture was loaded onto a moving van, and the Greene family waved goodbye as the moving van drove away from China and started its journey to Water Tower. Gooney Bird stopped. Every child in the classroom had a hand raised, and even Mrs. Pigeon was waving her arm. I'll have an intermission now for questions, Gooney Bird said. Chelsea, you're first. Why did Mr. Greene have 43 pairs of false teeth? Chelsea asked. The false teeth are not part of this story, Gooney Bird said. Malcolm? Malcolm had looked up from his "I will not put anything in my nose" paper. His eyes were very wide. Tell about the money collection, he said. That's another story, Gooney Bird said. Beanie? When are you going to tell about the prince and the diamonds? Beanie asked. Gooney Bird thought it over. On Monday, I'll tell it. Now, there's time for one more question before I continue. Mrs. Pigeon, did you have your hand raised? Mrs. Pigeon nodded. Gooney Bird, she said in a nice voice. You have an amazing imagination, and we think you are wonderful at telling stories. Don't we, class? She looked around, and almost all the children nodded. But I want to be certain that the children understand that these are made-up stories. So I want to point out, my stories are all absolutely true, Gooney Bird said. I want to point out, Mrs. Pigeon went on, that of course we all know that China is a foreign country across the ocean, and that a moving van could never drive from China to Water Tower. Gooney Bird rearranged her pearls and sighed. Mrs. Pigeon, she said, why don't we take a few minutes for research? Is there an atlas in the bookcase? Mrs. Pigeon laughed and said, of course. She went to the bookcase and took out a book of maps called an atlas. Now, said Gooney Bird, would you find out if there are other Chinas? Other Chinas? I don't think. Mrs. Pigeon began turning the pages of the atlas. She found the index at the back. My goodness, Mrs. Pigeon said after a minute. There's a China in Texas. Correct, said Gooney Bird. And what else? There's a China in Maine. Correct, said Gooney Bird. And California. There's a China Lake. And my goodness, look, in North Carolina. And now it's time to continue this story, Gooney Bird announced. Where were we? Oh, yes, I remember. The moving van had just left China. She took up the story again. After the moving van left China, the Greene family loaded up their station wagon with 5 big suitcases. Then they added a lawnmower that they had forgotten to put in the moving van, a cooler full of ham sandwiches and iced tea, a bundled up stack of National Geographic's and an orange and white cat named Catman, who had no tail because he had flicked his former tail once under the lawnmower. The last thing they put into the station wagon was a rolled-up rug from the front porch of their house. It was too long to fit. They tried it sideways and folded and upside down, but it still wouldn't fit. "Let's leave it behind," Mr. Greene suggested. But Mrs. Greene began to cry. "It was my mother's," she said. "There's a stain on it where my mother spilled some black bean soup 40 years ago. I feel sentimental about that rug." So Mr. Greene agreed to take the rug because it made him cry too, if his wife cried. He decided to put the back window of the station wagon down so that the end of the rolled-up rug could stick out. He made certain that everything was nicely arranged and that Catman had a comfortable place to sleep on the back seat, just beneath the end of the rug and next to the place where Gooney Bird would sit. Mr. Greene and Mrs. Greene and Gooney Bird Greene all got into the car and drove away from China, starting their long journey to Water Tower. They drove for many, many hours. They ate all of the ham sandwiches and drank all of the iced tea. They stopped to get gas. They went to the bathroom. They played the car radio and listened to news and operas and football games and talk shows about love relationships. Suddenly, Gooney Bird glanced down and noticed with dismay that her beloved Catman had disappeared. She looked around the floor of the back seat, but Catman was not there. She heard a small sound like a purr coming from inside the rolled-up rug. She knew that Catman had entered the rug. He probably found it a warm and dark and cozy place. But Gooney Bird was worried about Catman. She decided to try and get him out. She reached into the rolled-up center of the rug, but he slithered away beyond her hands. She looked at the backs of her parents' heads, wondering if she should tell them about the problem with Catman. But her mother was dozing and her father was driving, watching the road carefully and listening to a radio program about whales. So Gooney Bird decided to wiggle into the rug herself to rescue Catman. "Oh no," Kiko cried. "I'm going to faint." "Shh," the other children said. It was dark and dusty and a very tight squeeze inside the rolled-up rug, but Gooney Bird wiggled inch by inch toward Catman. Catman slithered away inch by inch. She could see his glittering eyes as he backed away from her. Gooney Bird was determined to rescue him. She continued forward. Suddenly, an amazing thing happened. Even though Gooney Bird was not very large and did not weigh very much and was not wearing her heavy diamond earrings from the palace that day, her weight inside the rolled-up rug caused it to tilt. At that moment, Mr. Greene leaned forward to change the radio station, and the car went over a pothole in the road. The rolled-up rug containing both Catman and Gooney Bird slid out the back of the station wagon and flew through the air before it landed at the side of the road in some thick grass beside a fence post. A cow chewing a purple flower looked curiously at it and then wandered away. The station wagon drove on, around a curve in the road. Slowly, the rug unrolled. Catman's fur was standing on end. And if he had had a tail, his tail would have been sticking straight up in the air. For a moment, Catman stood still, looking at Gooney Bird. Then he ran away, very fast. Gooney Bird sat up. She was not entirely sure what had happened, but she was not hurt. She simply wondered where her family was, and her cat, and the car. Other cars stopped and people got out. Many people offered her a drink of water from their bottles of Evian. But Gooney Bird wasn't thirsty. After a while, a police car with a flashing light came. A TV reporter came, and a cameraman. Well, the policeman talked on his radio. The TV reporter, a woman with very large hair, interviewed Gooney Bird and called her the little girl who had a flying carpet ride. In the interview, Gooney Bird described Catman and asked people to call the station if they found him, but she never got Catman back. Eventually, the police car took her to her parents, who were both crying at a gas station 4 miles down the road. When Gooney Bird and her parents were finally reunited, everyone, including 2 policemen, a TV reporter, and the gas station owner, hugged and kissed and did the tango. The end. What a lovely story, Mrs. Pigeon said, and an exciting one too, but a little sad to lose your kitty that way. Catman is not a kitty, Gooney Bird said. He is a cat. And I didn't say that I lost him. I just said that I never got him back. So no one found him and called the TV station? Actually, they did, Gooney Bird replied. But where is Catman now? Asked Mrs. Pigeon. He was consumed by a cow, Gooney Bird said. But that's a different story. By a cow? You're joking, Mrs. Pigeon said. No, said Gooney Bird. I'm not joking. I tell only absolutely true stories. Tell it, the children called. I will, Gooney Bird said. Another day. And we'll end here, and on another day, we'll hear what other stories Gooney Bird has to tell. We've been reading Gooney Bird Greene by Lois Lowry and illustrated by Mitty Thomas. The book was published by Houghton Mifflin in 2002. And my name's Mary, and I'm coming to you from the Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. And until next time, when we continue reading about Gooney Bird, bye-bye.